Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the Hamptons estate as Richard Blackwell adjusted his platinum cufflinks one final time. At 42, he had everything a man could desire: a tech empire worth $300 million, a stunning bride 20 years his junior, and a guest list that read like Forbes' most powerful. The oceanfront mansion buzzed with 500 of New York's elite, their laughter mixing with the string quartet's melodies. Richard's bride, Isabella, floated through the crowd in her custom Vera Wang gown, the $30,000 creation trailing behind her like liquid starlight. She had been his trophy, his crown jewel, carefully selected from Manhattan's social circuit. Their relationship was as calculated as his business deals, built on mutual benefit rather than passion. She provided him with beauty and social status. He provided her with unlimited access to luxury. The catering staff moved like ghosts through the crowd, serving champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a week. Richard noticed one particular server, a young woman with calloused hands and tired eyes, carefully navigating between guests who barely acknowledged her existence. She reminded him of his own humble beginnings in Detroit, a memory he had buried beneath layers of success and expensive suits. As the ceremony began, Richard stood at the altar overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, the sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. His mind wandered to his business empire, the latest acquisition deals, the congressional lobbying efforts that would secure his company's futures. Love had never been part of his vocabulary. Power and control were the currencies he understood. The reception transformed the estate's gardens into a fairyland of white roses and twinkling lights. Ice sculptures depicted swans and hearts, while the 5-tier cake stood as a monument to excess. Richard's best man, his business partner Marcus, delivered a speech about success and partnership, carefully avoiding any mention of Richard's mysterious past or his complete lack of family at the wedding. The guest list included senators, tech moguls, Hollywood producers, and old money families whose wealth traced back generations. Yet among this sea of designer clothing and practiced smiles, Richard felt oddly disconnected. He observed the performance of happiness, the social theater that his money had bought, but something felt hollow. Perhaps it was the absence of genuine relationships, or perhaps it was the nagging feeling that success had cost him more than he realized. As dinner was served, Richard noticed the catering staff bringing in additional help for the evening shift. Among them was a young boy, perhaps 12 or 13, who seemed out of place in the formal setting. The child wore a simple white shirt and black pants, clearly a uniform provided by the catering company. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his posture suggested he was trying hard to remain invisible while helping clear tables. The boy moved with careful precision, stacking plates and collecting glasses while staying at the periphery of the celebration. Richard found himself watching the child's movements, something about his presence creating an odd tension in his chest. There was something familiar in the way the boy held his shoulders, the determined set of his jaw as he worked diligently, despite his obvious youth. The live band began playing jazz standards, while couples moved onto the marble dance floor that had been installed specifically for the occasion. Isabella expected their first dance to be perfect, choreographed and practiced until every step was flawless. As they swayed to the music, Richard's eyes continued to drift toward the working staff, particularly the young boy who seemed to disappear and reappear like a shadow. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine and saltwater as guests moved between the indoor ballroom and the outdoor terraces. Conversations flowed around stocks, real estate investments, and political connections. Richard participated automatically, his responses polished by years of networking events and board meetings. Yet, part of his attention remained focused on the catering staff, on the world of service and struggle that existed parallel to his own privileged reality. As the night progressed and champagne flowed freely, the atmosphere became more relaxed. Guests laughed louder, conversations grew more intimate, and the carefully maintained facades began to slip. Richard found himself studying the faces around him, wondering how many of these relationships were genuine and how many were simply strategic alliances disguised as friendships. The young server boy continued his work, occasionally disappearing into the service areas before emerging again with fresh supplies or to clear more tables. Each time Richard caught sight of him, that strange feeling of recognition intensified. It was as if seeing a ghost from another life, a reminder of something important he had forgotten or chosen to ignore. The estate's security team maintained discreet positions throughout the property, ensuring that only invited guests and authorized personnel remained on the grounds. Yet something about the boy's presence seemed to bypass these concerns, as if he belonged there, despite his obvious difference from the wealthy attendees. The contrast between his simple appearance and their elaborate costumes created a striking visual that Richard found increasingly difficult to ignore. The collision happened near the dessert station as guests clustered around the elaborate pastry display. The young boy, carrying a tray of empty champagne flutes, accidentally bumped into Richard while navigating through the crowd. Crystals scattered across the marble floor in a symphony of breaking glass, the sound cutting through the evening's sophisticated chatter like a blade through silk. "I'm so sorry." "Sir?" the boy stammered, immediately dropping to his knees to collect the scattered pieces. His voice carried a slight tremor of fear, the kind that comes from knowing a single mistake could cost him his job. "Please forgive me. I'll clean this up right away." Richard looked down at the child, ready to dismiss the incident with the casual indifference he typically showed service staff. But as their eyes met for the first time, the world seemed to shift on its axis. The boy's face was like looking into a mirror of his own past. The same deep-set brown eyes, the same sharp jawline, the same distinctive cleft in his chin that Richard had inherited from his father. The resemblance was so striking that Richard felt his breath catch in his throat. The boy's features were softer, younger, but the bone structure was unmistakably similar. Even their hair grew in the same pattern, with a stubborn cowlick that refused to lay flat despite obvious attempts to tame it. The child's skin was darker, suggesting mixed heritage, but the fundamental architecture of his face was hauntingly familiar. "What's your name, son?" Richard asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the party's continued festivities. The question came out more gently than he intended, a stark contrast to his usual authoritative tone with staff. "Tommy Rodriguez, sir," the boy replied, still kneeling among the glass fragments. His hands shook slightly as he continued cleaning, clearly aware that he was speaking directly to the groom, the man whose wedding he was supposed to serve invisibly. "I work with my mom's catering company. She's the head chef tonight." Richard felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm evening air. Rodriguez, a name that triggered memories he had spent decades trying to forget. Memories of a young woman named Maria Rodriguez, a housekeeper at his family's Detroit mansion during his teenage years. A woman with kind eyes and gentle hands who had shown him more maternal affection than his own cold, distant mother ever had. The boy looked up at him again, and Richard saw something else in those familiar eyes, a maturity that seemed beyond his years, the kind of quiet strength that comes from growing up with responsibility and hardship. It was the same look Richard remembered seeing in his own mirror as a child, when he realized that money couldn't buy the one thing he truly wanted: genuine love and connection. "How old are you, Tommy?" Richard asked, crouching down to help collect the glass, ignoring the surprised looks from nearby guests who weren't accustomed to seeing him interact with service staff, let alone help them clean up accidents. 13, sir. I'll be 14 next month," Tommy replied, his voice growing steadier as he sensed that Richard wasn't angry about the broken glasses. "My mom says I can start working part-time to help with expenses once I turn 14. She works really hard to take care of me and my little sister." The timeline crashed into Richard's memory like a freight train. 13 years ago, he had been 29, recently returned from business school, arrogant and reckless. He remembered those summer nights when his parents traveled to Europe, leaving him alone in the mansion with the staff. He remembered Maria, barely 18 herself, vulnerable and beautiful, working late shifts to support her own struggling family. Richard's hands began to tremble as he picked up the glass shards, the sharp edges threatening to cut through his carefully constructed reality. The math was simple and terrifying. Tommy's age aligned perfectly with that summer of reckless youth, when Richard had taken advantage of his position and power in ways that now made him sick to contemplate. "Tell me about your family, Tommy," Richard said, his voice hoarse with growing dread. Your father, is he around? Tommy's expression grew guarded, the way children learn to protect themselves when discussing painful topics. I don't have a father, sir. It's just me, my mom, and my sister. Mom doesn't like to talk about it much. She says some men make promises they don't keep, and it's better to build your own strength than wait for someone else to take care of you. The words hit Richard like physical blows. He remembered making promises to Maria, whispering sweet lies in the darkness of his parents' estate, telling her he cared about her future while knowing he would discard her the moment it became convenient. He remembered the last night she worked at the house, how she looked at him with tears in her eyes, trying to tell him something important that he was too selfish and scared to hear. Isabella's laughter carried across the ballroom as she posed for photographs with their wedding guests, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring near the dessert table. The party continued around them, but Richard felt as though he was standing in the center of a hurricane, everything spinning out of control while he remained frozen in this moment of recognition. Your mother, Richard whispered, afraid to voice the question but unable to stop himself. Is she here tonight? Is she Maria Rodriguez? Tommy's eyes widened with surprise and something else, a flicker of hope perhaps, or recognition. You know my mom? Yes, she's the head chef. She's been talking about this job for weeks, how important it was to do everything perfectly. She said the client was someone special from her past, but she seemed nervous about it. Richard felt the world tilting beneath his feet as the full magnitude of his past choices came crashing down upon him. Maria was here, in his house, preparing food for his wedding celebration. The woman he had abandoned 13 years ago, pregnant and alone, had built a life for herself and their son while he climbed the ladder of success, never looking back to see the casualties of his ambition. The kitchen hummed with controlled chaos as Maria Rodriguez orchestrated the final courses of the evening. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her chef's coat bore the subtle stains of a night spent creating culinary perfection for people who would never know her name. At 31, she had transformed herself from a vulnerable teenager into a respected professional, building her catering business from nothing through sheer determination and skill. She paused in her preparations, wiping perspiration from her brow as she noticed Tommy hadn't returned from clearing the dessert station. The boy was reliable beyond his years, a trait born from necessity rather than choice. Maria had raised him to be invisible in wealthy spaces, to work hard without drawing attention, to survive in a world that would judge them by their circumstances rather than their character. Through the kitchen service window, she caught glimpses of the opulent reception continuing in full swing. The bride danced with various guests, her laughter carrying across the marble floors like crystal chimes. Maria had catered dozens of high society events over the years, but tonight felt different. When she had received the contract and seen the client's name, Richard Blackwell, her hands had trembled for hours. She remembered him as he was 13 years ago. Young, handsome, full of privilege and careless confidence. He had been her first love, her first heartbreak, her first lesson in the cruel reality that some bridges could never be crossed. No matter how strong the attraction or how sincere the whispered promises seemed in the darkness. She had been naive enough to believe that love could transcend social boundaries, that his gentle touches and sweet words meant something beyond momentary pleasure. The pregnancy test had shown positive 3 weeks after her last day at the Blackwell estate. Maria had tried to contact Richard, leaving messages with his assistant, writing letters that were returned unopened. His parents had made it clear that any attempt to involve their son would result in legal action and the destruction of her family's reputation. She had faced the choice between fighting a battle she couldn't win or protecting the child growing inside her with quiet dignity. Tommy finally appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face pale and his hands still slightly shaky from his encounter. "Mom, I need to tell you something," he said quietly, pulling her aside from the other kitchen staff. "I accidentally bumped into the groom, and when he looked at me..." Maria felt her heart stop as she saw the recognition in her son's eyes. She had always known this moment might come, had rehearsed conversations in her mind about identity and heritage, but she had hoped it would happen on her terms. When Tommy was older and better equipped to handle the complexity of his origins. "What did he say to you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The other kitchen staff continued their work around them, unaware that the carefully constructed world Maria had built was beginning to crumble. "He knew your name. He asked about our family, about my father. The way he looked at me, it was like seeing himself." "Is he?" Tommy couldn't finish the question, but his eyes held a mixture of hope and confusion that broke Maria's heart. Before she could answer, one of the servers burst into the kitchen with urgent news. "The groom is asking to speak with the head chef. He says it's important, something about personally thanking the kitchen staff. He's waiting in the study." Maria felt the blood drain from her face. She had successfully avoided face-to-face contact with Richard all evening, managing the catering operation from behind the scenes while he celebrated his new marriage. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She was providing the perfect wedding feast for the man who had abandoned her pregnant and alone, now watching him marry someone else while their son cleared his tables. "I'll handle the other staff," Maria told her assistant chef, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Keep the dessert service running smoothly. Tommy, stay here and help with the final cleanup." But Tommy shook his head, his young face set with determination that reminded Maria painfully of Richard at the same age. "No, Mom, if he wants to meet the head chef and if he really is. If he's my father, then I deserve to know the truth. I'm old enough to handle whatever this is." The walk through the mansion's corridors felt like a journey through Maria's past. She recognized the artwork on the walls, the expensive furnishings, the subtle markers of wealth that had once made her feel so small and out of place. Now, as a successful businesswoman with her own reputation and achievements, she felt differently. She had earned her place in any room through hard work and dedication. Regardless of her humble origins, the study door was partially open, and through the gap Maria could see Richard standing by the window, still wearing his wedding tuxedo, but with his bow tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled. He turned as they entered, and the years collapsed between them like a falling house of cards. His face was older, more lined, but his eyes were the same deep brown that looked back at her every day in Tommy's features. "Maria," he said softly, her name sounding strange and weighted coming from his lips after so many years of silence. "I wasn't sure you would come." "You hired my company for your wedding," she replied, her voice carefully controlled. "I honor my professional commitments regardless of personal history." Tommy waited outside, but Richard spoke before the boy could move. "No, let him stay. I think we all need to have this conversation together." He looked directly at Tommy, and the resemblance between them was so striking that Maria wondered how no one else at the party had noticed it. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 13 years of unspoken words, missed opportunities, and carefully buried truths. Outside, the wedding celebration continued in blissful ignorance. While in this small study, 3 lives prepared to collide with the force of long-suppressed reality. Richard's next words would either destroy the careful life Maria had built or finally provide Tommy with the answers he had every right to know. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, and Maria realized that no amount of preparation could have readied her for this confrontation with the past. Richard's hands shook as he poured himself a whiskey from the crystal decanter on his desk, the amber liquid catching the soft light from the table lamp. The study felt smaller with the 3 of them inside, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down like a physical force. Through the closed door, they could hear the distant sounds of his wedding reception continuing, guests laughing and dancing while his world quietly imploded. "I remember the night you tried to tell me," Richard said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "It was your last day working at my parents' house. You kept trying to get me alone, and I kept avoiding you because I knew what you were going to say, and I was too much of a coward to hear it." Maria's composure cracked slightly, 13 years of suppressed anger and hurt flickering across her features. "You knew I was pregnant? You knew, and you still let me leave with nothing. Let me face it all alone?" Tommy looked between his mother and the man who was his father, processing this confirmation of what he had suspected since their eyes first met. The boy's expression was unreadable, but Richard could see the wheels turning, the pieces of his life's puzzle finally clicking into place. "I suspected," Richard admitted, unable to meet Maria's eyes. But I convinced myself it wasn't possible, or that it wasn't my responsibility. I was 29 years old, but I acted like a scared teenager. My parents had made it clear that any complications with the staff would be handled through lawyers and NDAs. I took the coward's way out and pretended nothing had happened. The silence that followed was deafening. Maria stood straighter, her chef's coat seeming like armor as she found her voice again. Do you have any idea what the last 13 years have been like? Working 3 jobs while pregnant, sleeping in my car some nights because I couldn't afford rent, raising your son while you built your empire without ever wondering if we were alive or dead? Richard flinched at each word as if she were slapping him. Maria, don't, she cut him off sharply. Don't you dare apologize now, on your wedding night. As if sorry could fix 13 years of abandonment. I didn't come here for your guilt or your money. I came here because I built a business good enough to cater your wedding, and I earned that success myself. Tommy finally spoke, his young voice cutting through the adult tension with startling clarity. Did you ever think about me? Did you ever wonder if you had a son? The question hit Richard like a physical blow. He looked at this remarkable boy, his son, who had grown up without a father's guidance yet carried himself with dignity and strength that Richard wasn't sure he possessed at twice Tommy's age. The boy deserved honesty, even if it painted Richard in an even worse light. I tried not to think about you, Richard admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Every time the possibility crossed my mind, I pushed it away and buried myself deeper in work. I told myself that if you existed, you were better off without me. I was selfish and focused only on building my fortune, convincing myself that emotional connections were weaknesses I couldn't afford. Tommy processed this with the kind of mature consideration that no 13-year-old should need to possess. What about now? Now that you know for sure that I exist, that I'm your son, what happens next? Before Richard could answer, the study door burst open. Isabella stood in the doorway, her wedding gown rustling around her like storm clouds. Her perfectly applied makeup was slightly smudged, and her eyes held the glassy brightness that came from too much champagne and too little patience. Richard, darling, what are you doing hiding in here? Our guests are asking for you, and the photographer wants to take the final formal shots before. She stopped mid-sentence as she took in the scene, her new husband looking disheveled and emotional, standing with 2 members of the catering staff in what was clearly an intense personal conversation. Isabella, this isn't a good time, Richard said weakly, but his bride's sharp eyes had already noticed the resemblance between him and Tommy. Even through her champagne haze, the family similarity was unmistakable. Oh my God, she whispered, her hand flying to her throat where her diamond necklace caught the light. This boy, he looks exactly like you. Richard, who is this child? Maria stepped protectively in front of Tommy, her maternal instincts overriding everything else. We were just finishing our conversation. We'll leave now so you can return to your celebration. But Isabella's society-trained mind was already calculating the implications, her face shifting from confusion to horror as the pieces fell into place. This is your son, isn't it? You have a secret child with the help. Her voice rose to a near shriek that could probably be heard over the party music. Tommy's face flushed with shame and anger at being called the help in such a dismissive tone. Richard saw his son's reaction and felt a surge of protective fury that surprised him with its intensity. Isabella, lower your voice, he said sharply. Yes, Tommy is my son. Maria and we have history that I should have handled differently 13 years ago. His bride's face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, disgust, calculation, and finally cold rage. On our wedding night? You're telling me about your bastard child on our wedding night? Do you have any idea what this could do to our reputation? To our social standing? The word bastard hung in the air like a slap, and Richard watched Tommy's face crumble slightly before the boy straightened his shoulders with determined pride. In that moment, Richard saw more courage in his 13-year-old son than he had shown in his entire adult life. Get out, Richard said quietly to Isabella, his voice deadly calm. Get out of this room right now. Excuse me. Isabella's voice reached a pitch that could shatter crystal. I am your wife. You married me 3 hours ago. You don't get to throw me out for this situation. Richard looked at Maria and Tommy, then back at the woman he had married for all the wrong reasons. The contrast between them was stark and telling. Isabella, beautiful and polished but showing her true character under pressure. Maria, worn by hard work but radiating strength and dignity. And Tommy, his son, standing tall despite the cruel words thrown at him by adults who should have known better. The choice, when it came to him, was surprisingly easy. The wedding reception ground to a halt as Isabella's shrieks echoed through the mansion's corridors. Guests gathered in confused clusters, their champagne glasses forgotten as they tried to process the drama unfolding before them. The string quartet faltered to a stop, their elegant melodies replaced by the sound of Isabella's increasingly hysterical accusations. "He has a bastard child with the kitchen help," she screamed to anyone within hearing distance, her carefully constructed social mask completely shattered. "My husband has been lying to me. This whole wedding is a sham." Richard stood in the study doorway, watching his new wife's public breakdown with a strange sense of detachment. Behind him, Maria held Tommy close, her arm protective around her son's shoulders. The boy's face was pale but determined, processing this adult chaos with the kind of resilience that spoke to his mother's excellent parenting under impossible circumstances. Marcus, Richard's business partner and best man, pushed through the crowd of gawking guests. "Richard, what the hell is happening here? Isabella is making some pretty serious accusations, and half of Manhattan's social elite is standing in your foyer, listening to every word." Richard looked at his oldest friend, a man who had shared his rise to power and who understood the calculated nature of his marriage to Isabella. Marcus's expression was carefully neutral, but Richard could see the concern in his eyes, not for personal feelings, but for the potential business ramifications of this public spectacle. "She's not wrong," Richard said simply, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet space. "Tommy is my son. I abandoned him and his mother 13 years ago because I was a coward who cared more about my reputation than my responsibilities." The admission sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Senators and tech moguls who had been toasting Richard's success moments earlier now stared at him with the kind of fascination usually reserved for car accidents and natural disasters. Cell phones appeared as if by magic, capturing every moment of the unfolding drama for social media posterity. Isabella's face contorted with rage and humiliation. "You're destroying everything. Our marriage, our social standing, our future. All for some Mexican whore and her— Stop!" The single word cut through Isabella's tirade like a blade. Richard stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate silence. "You will not speak about Maria or my son that way ever again. In fact, you won't speak about them at all." He turned to address the crowd of guests, many of whom had their phones recording every word. "Ladies and gentlemen, I owe you all an apology for this disruption to what should have been a celebration. However, I've just learned something that changes everything I thought I knew about what really matters in life." Maria tried to pull Tommy toward the service exit, desperate to escape the spectacle they had inadvertently created. But Richard caught her arm gently. "Please don't go. Not again. I've made enough mistakes for several lifetimes. But letting you walk away twice would be unforgivable." Tommy looked up at his father with those familiar brown eyes, seeing past the tuxedo and the wealth to the flawed man underneath. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. The same question he had posed in the study, but now laden with different implications. Richard knelt down to his son's level, ignoring the cameras and the whispered conversations swirling around them. "Now I try to make up for 13 years of being absent from your life. I try to earn the right to be called your father, instead of just the man who contributed DNA to your existence." He stood and faced Maria, the woman who had raised their son alone while he built his empire, on foundations of selfishness and cowardice. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know money can't buy back lost time or erase the struggle you've endured. But if you'll let me, I want to try to be the father Tommy deserves and the man I should have been 13 years ago." Isabella's laughter was bitter and sharp. "This is insane. You're throwing away everything we've built together for a moment of guilt? What about our merger? What about the political connections? What about our life? Richard looked at his bride of 3 hours, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. Isabella was beautiful, connected and intelligent, but her reaction to discovering his son revealed the emptiness at her core. She saw Tommy not as a child who deserved love and recognition, but as a threat to her social climbing ambitions. What life, Isabella? We have a business arrangement disguised as a marriage. We have social functions and photo opportunities and strategic alliances. But when I look at my son, a boy who has more character and strength at 13 than I've shown in 42 years, I realize I've been living a hollow existence. He turned back to Maria and Tommy, his voice softer now. I can't undo the past, but I can try to build a different future. Tommy, you don't owe me anything. I'm the one who owes you 13 years of bedtime stories, birthday parties, school plays, and father-son conversations. If you're willing to let me try, I'd like to start learning how to be your dad. The boy considered this with the same serious expression he had worn throughout the evening, an expression that reminded Richard painfully of his own childhood habit of overthinking every situation. Finally, Tommy spoke with wisdom that belied his years. I don't need you to buy me things or make up for lost time with expensive gifts. I need you to show up, to be someone I can be proud to call my father. Can you do that? Richard felt tears he hadn't shed since childhood threatening to spill over. I can try, son. I want to try. As the wedding guests began to disperse, some in disgust, others in fascination, and a few in quiet approval of Richard's unexpected moment of moral clarity, the Blackwell family began to redefine itself. Not with ceremony or contracts or social conventions, but with the simple courage to choose love over convenience, truth over reputation, and connection over isolation. The wedding was over, but for the first time in his life, Richard Blackwell was ready to begin building something real.